I was asked to do something about Call to a Noble Adventure. I know that a few of you have got either a copy of what I'm going to be saying, which has got the excerpts from it in it, or I see a few people have brought a booklet. Is there anybody who's in the middle of a gap where there's no text available in any form? Because I can let you have my copy. Brilliant. There we go. If I knew how to get it from a PC to an iPad, I'd help you out, but unfortunately I don't. So, but what I basically thought the best thing to do would be, because I know that a large number of you here in the room are probably a good deal more familiar with this text than I am, because you've seen it go through the 100 and so odd revisions that it's been through before the final version came out, which is the first one I got to know. So what I thought was, well, there's not much point in introducing you to the document because you know it better than I do. So maybe the best thing to do might be for us to revisit the document today in the light of the experience that we've had as Catholic youth ministers since it came out, and ask ourselves, how far have we come, and where is this document pointing us to carry on moving? So for those of you that have got the PowerPoint version of the talk, those of you who are lowly PC users like me, or those of you who have brought a MacBook that is able to communicate with a USB device, you'll see that I've called this PowerPoint Milestones and Signposts as a way of trying to get those two ideas. Where have we come since we got this, and where is this pointing us to continue to move to? And those might be two slightly different things. It might be that taking account of where we've come from, now looking at the documents again, we might think, oh, that's interesting. It's maybe calling me to go in a slightly different direction now. Or perhaps what we hear from one another today might enrich our understanding of this document and help us to see whether there are new ways to go. One of the things that I think will help us to move forward is part of paragraph 39 of Call to a Noble Adventure, which I think gives us a vision that we can use here together today. It says this: the vision that we have set out unites all the various expressions of our youth ministry, yet recognising that there is no one single methodology for calling, engaging and forming our young people in faith. Hence, all those working with young people should seek opportunities to reflect regularly on their ministry in the light of the vision we have outlined. And as I was reading this during the week last week, I thought, that's a really good starting point for us, because in a way, that's what we're doing by gathering in these few days. We're reflecting on our ministry in the light of the vision that this document gave us. I'd like to use that as a kind of guiding moment for our time together now, and maybe even for the time that we want to spend together for the rest of this week. If we then move on to the next slide, those of you who've got the slides, one of the things that I found very attractive about the language of parts of the document is that it talks about both us and also the young people with and for whom we work as standing on thresholds. And I thought that was a nice bit of language. It's a bit of language that I relate to certainly very much myself. So the section on Goal B of the 4 goals, the one which is about discipleship, uses, I think, some interesting language about people who work with the young. We stand, it says, on the thresholds between church and society and seek to create opportunities to invite a young person to cross between the two. And I take that to mean to cross between the two in both directions, from society to church, from church to society. To be somebody who moves between those two ways of being a Christian. And then interestingly, later on, in the same section, it uses very similar language about young people themselves. It says, young people are a bridge, I think it means for us, this is in paragraph 24, young people are a bridge into a foreign and fast-moving culture. So, we are called to be people that stand on this threshold between church and society. And we recognise that for us, who are engaged in youth ministry in the Catholic Church, young people are also a bridge for us into a culture in which they are probably more at home than we are. Whether that be because we're older than they are, whether that be because of our background, whether that be because of the reality in which they live, which is perhaps slightly more in society than in church. However that happens, what that seems to me to indicate is that a relational approach to youth ministry is one of the things that Call to Noble Adventure is inviting us to. And however we view that in terms of relationship, I think that's one of the very rich things that this document, this approach to youth ministry, is calling us to put into place. So, what I think it indicates, to me at any rate, as a Salesian, is that a relational youth ministry helps us to be witnesses to the young people, and it also helps the young people to become witnesses, in the sense that connects, I think, very well with our experience this morning at the catacombs, because many of those who were buried in the catacombs were honoured with the term witness, martyr. And it connects in, I think, with what we've come to and what we're going to today. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with the young people, with and for whom we work. And starting with the young, I find some really, really powerful expressions of what our attitude to them is and what we think of young people is. I love the way in which the document talks about young people, particularly from the section on Goal D, helping young people to become prophetic witnesses of Christ. So in paragraph 32, it says of young people, with their rare qualities of passion, energy and clear-sightedness, they counteract the natural tendencies we may have to a sedentary faith life. And I certainly connected with that very much, partly because I know a lot of young people who that describes, and partly because it described me when I was a bit younger. And I relate to it very much. That attitude, for me at any rate, of wanting to commit myself to the gospel in a radical way that might shake people up. It might shake up the world, it might shake up politics, it might shake up the church. And that's certainly something that I relate to myself because of my background and where I come from. And as a Salesian of Don Bosco, I find the language that's present much earlier in the document very attractive too. In paragraph 7, it says this: young people enjoy times of outrageous hope and invulnerability. I love that. I love the fact that outrageous is used to speak about their hope and their feelings of invulnerability. Their optimism and idealism often shines as a light amidst the scepticism of today's world. I think that's wonderful language about the value of young people to the church and to the world. Later on, the document uses very similar words again. In paragraph 16, there's a wonderful celebration of a number of images of sanctity in young people, biblical and also in the history of the church. And it sums them up by saying, in every case, God used the young person's ability to be flexible and to think in new ways, to be ridiculously optimistic, I love that, to commit with wholehearted passion. These young people set history alight and carried the kingdom of God forward into new territory. And that language about the young is one that finds a deep resonance in my heart as a youth minister, as a Catholic, as a Salesian of Don Bosco. And what I'd like us to briefly reflect on as we start this period of time together today is to ask, how do the young people that we work with evangelise us because of these characteristics? How are they bearers of the gospel message to you and me? How are they prophetic witnesses of Christ to the church, to us, who are church. I can just leave that with you for a couple of seconds. You might be thinking of a particular young person. No, often we do. You might be thinking of a particular way in which you work with young people, in which they bring the gospel very much alive when you work with them in that way. What I'd like you to do is to turn to your neighbour and share with them what it is that comes into your heart, into your mind, as you hear those words about young people. Just give you a minute to talk to them about that. One of the things that I think is wonderful about the document is the way in which it talks about youth ministry as being Eucharistic. And it's one of the things that's been pulled out of documents and put on one of the pages that's got photographs on it. And I think it's a really important one. It might even be the first photograph in the document. And it brings out that element of youth ministry being Eucharistic. And one of the things that it says about that, and I think this is part of that bit that's been pulled out and put on the photograph page, is it says in paragraph number 2, so that's obviously how important it is, it's right in the beginning. Youth ministry, it says, is Eucharistic at its core. It is always in the context of community. It is nourishing. It is sacramental. And I think that's one of the things that makes our Catholic approach to youth ministry distinctive amongst other youth organisations. I'm not saying that no other youth organisation that isn't Catholic has this kind of understanding, but I think it's really at the heart of what we do as Catholic youth ministers. It names one of the central realities for us. And I think our understanding of even that one sentence, youth ministry is Eucharistic at its core, it is always in the context of community, it is nourishing, it is sacramental. Our understanding of that one sentence varies, and varies quite a lot. And I think that's one of the things which is eminently realistic about this document. This document is happy to name and celebrate that diversity. And it's a diversity that we have in our group here today. And that's great to see. That's what makes us who we are. And it's worth our while pondering that for a minute and just celebrating it and sharing it with one another. Because, in a way, there are two words in that sentence that can act as starting points. One's at the beginning and one's at the end. And often what they can do is they can result in two slightly different models of how you do this in working with young people. And both of them are fine. And both of them are legitimate. And both of them are Catholic. One of them tends to start from the word Eucharistic, which, interestingly, in our document is spelled with a capital E. And the photograph that accompanies it makes this idea of Eucharistic very specific. It puts it very much at the heart of the celebration of the sacrament of Eucharist, and makes that the core of Catholic youth ministry. And that's right, and it's correct, and it's important. After all, the celebration of Eucharist is both the source and the summit of Christian life. And that's something, that's a phrase that's used a couple of times during the course of this document, referring us to the Regention in Vatican II. And there's another way of understanding it too, that starts from a slightly different place, but I think results in a Eucharistic youth ministry with a slightly different flavour to it, a slightly different form to it. And that's to start from the word sacramental that comes at the end of that sentence. And what that kind of youth ministry tends to do is it tends to stress a different bit of that source and summit language. A youth ministry which is Eucharistic in the first sense tends to talk about youth ministry coming from and returning to the celebration of Eucharist. A youth ministry in the second sense tends to talk about the celebration of the sacraments and the celebration of the Eucharist preeminently as being an intended destination. So you can have a signpost or you can have a milestone. And both of these are legitimate ways of understanding how we work with young people. What tends to happen, and I think it's very important to name this as we gather as a group of diverse groups who work with the young, is that in many groups, one of those approaches tends to be used in the main as the main way of doing it. As a Salesian Don Bosco, I recognise that one of the things that is a challenge to me as an individual, and indeed to my SDB province, is to actually get to the intended destination. One of the things that we spent a couple of years thinking about 3 or 4 years ago, was whether our evangelisation of young people was too implicit and needed to be more explicit. And that's another way of naming this, by linking it to the gospel rather than by linking it to the sacrament of the Eucharist. And for all of us, I think, there is a challenge here. It's a challenge of unity, and it's also a challenge of diversity. And it's a challenge of trying to see those two things as each feeding into the other one. So let's look at these two approaches for a minute and see what resonates from them in us. So, if you look at, it's probably the next slide, isn't it? Next slide. So, in Article 29, I think you've got both of these approaches being used in the same paragraph. And I suspect that's deliberate, because it shows us that they're all part of one picture, they're all part of one reality. The gospel message, says the document, can come to young people by using Jesus' own technique of transforming the ordinary to throw new light onto the spiritual. For example, using story, drama and art. That's one way in. It's a way in that I resonate with very much. It's a sacramental way of doing youth ministry. And it's not the only way. Later on in the same paragraph, the document tells us, at the same time, and I think those are really important words, at the same time, there is great need for liturgical catechesis to enable young people to engage fully with the Mass, finding meaning in the Sunday mystery that spills over into their daily lives. This is a youth ministry that tends to start from the celebration of the sacraments and talks about that mystery spilling over. That's lovely, lovely language. The way that what is there is so full an experience that it enlightens, it gives life to what goes on in the rest of that young person's life. And what I'd like you to do is to reflect for a moment on how you are Eucharistic in your work with young people. I share with you a little bit of how I am. How the organisation that you work with and for is Eucharistic in its work with young people. Does it tend to use one of these ways of talking about it more often than the other? Does your organisation try to bring them together, and if so, how do you do it? What kind of ways do you do it? How do you experience Eucharist? How do you experience sacramentality, to use those two words? And now what I'd like to do in a minute is just to share a bit of that with the people who are sat around you. But just for a minute, just try and connect with your experience of young people that we were just sharing with one another, your experience of sacramentality, your experience of Eucharist, how that comes to life with you in your work with young people. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is share this with a slightly bigger group, so maybe get into 3s and 4s to talk about this rather than just your neighbour. And spend a few minutes sharing that richness with one another. So I think, and you might already have started talking about this, in fact you probably have already started talking about this. One of the things about youth ministers is that we tend to be eminently practical people. So I'm sure that at least some of you, possibly in both dialogues so far, have been talking about actual situations with particular young people that you shared with one another as the basis of your reflection, and that's brilliant. What I want to do is to encourage anyone who hasn't so far, anyone who's been talking in more abstract, spiritual, I don't really know what terms to use, but in a different way, to now deliberately make that transition towards actual events with actual people. Because I think one of the things which is a real strength of the document that we're talking about this afternoon is that it does that, and it does that really well. It celebrates and it names the diversity that there is in Roman Catholic Youth Ministry in England and Wales. I think that's wonderful. And I think it's something that's good for us to touch into from time to time. To remind ourselves of that diversity, to perhaps learn from that diversity, to enrich our own approach to work with young people from that diversity that there is around us. So, in paragraph 10, I think there's a wonderful naming and celebrating of the diversity that there is in youth ministry in England and Wales. It says this: national agencies, such as CAFOD, the SVP and YCW, engage with young people across England and Wales with their service and action groups, helping to form young Christians committed to social and global justice and peace. Movements and communities, such as the Zion Community in Youth 2000, support young people's spirituality and their growth and discipleship. And I read that section of our document as a naming of diversity, not as a naming of difference. And I think sometimes we can, and I think it is, make the mistake of thinking that those things are complete differences. One of the things I think about viewing our understanding of Eucharist the way that we have been doing is that it is important as a first step to name that we do see these things differently. Yes, of course we do. And it's also important in the second step to recognise that the other way of viewing them is just as legitimate as ours is. I think that's one thing that draws us into union as Catholics. And whether you name that union as community, or whether you name it as participation in God, or whether you name it as communio in the Trinity, all these ways are ways of talking about our unity. And I think we need to name them whenever we gather together. We need to celebrate them. And we need to ask ourselves, what is it that I can learn from the diversity of a group like this, whenever we gather? From the diversity of young people, whenever we gather? One of the things I think that can threaten our unity is if we do view these things as, well, we do this and they do that, whoever they might be. Because what that tends to do is it turns differences into divisions, if we're not careful. It starts us not celebrating our unity. It starts us from dividing against one another. And that's not Catholic. Because Catholic means universal. The other thing it does, and strangely enough, I think it can do this, is that it can lead us, paradoxically enough, to an almost relativist understanding. I see it this way, and this way is right. They see it that way, and they're wrong. But they're only wrong because they're not like me. That's actually relativism. And Catholics are not relativists. That's one of, I think, the lasting legacies of Pope Benedict. His continual reminder to us that although all of us only see the reality of our Catholic faith from one point of view, ours, hardly surprising. I can't see it from someone else's point of view. I need somebody else to see it from somebody else's point of view, to name their point of view, looking at the same thing, and to share that richness with me. I can't do it on my own. And if I only ever mix with people that agree with me, then my point of view risks becoming the only one that's legitimate. And that's not Catholic. Because Catholic means universal. It means everybody. And I think one of the great things in our document is that it celebrates that diversity. It reminds us of it again and again and again. It uses language at various places which I'm sure challenges all of us. There's certainly quite a bit of language which challenges who I am and what I tend to do naturally when I work with you. Because I read some bits of it and I think, oh my goodness, I wouldn't say that. But I need to say that. I have to say that. I have to admit that that is an important way of working with people. Otherwise, I'm setting up barriers and divisions. One of the reasons why I think that the church is community, why it is that we are drawn into communion with God, is to help us to know, to help us to experience, to help us be challenged by this reality of our faith, that there is more than one legitimate way of being a Catholic, and that many of them are legitimate. Partly because that's a challenge to all of us to say, what is it in my work with young people that needs to be challenged? How is it that I need to grow? How is it that I need to learn from another way of doing it, something that doesn't come naturally to me, and try and incorporate some of that into what I do with young people? How is it indeed that I can present who I am, how I work, how I naturally relate to people, to someone else, in such a way that I present that as a gift, something that someone else can learn from, and that I receive the gift that they are in their work with you. Because it's that mutual exchange of gifts, I think, which is one of the things that can draw us deeper into communion with one another and with God and with the young. And that's what it's all about, surely. What I'd like to suggest then is that for our last conversation together, for a few minutes, I invite you to form that small group that you were just in again, and this time to reflect a little more explicitly on that one bit of threshold language that we haven't actually talked a lot about so far. We've talked about young people as thresholds. We haven't talked so much about ourselves as thresholds yet. So just to remind you of that text that I used right at the beginning. Our document tells us we stand on the thresholds between church and society, and we seek to create opportunities to invite a young person to cross between the two. What I'd invite you to share with one another is a little bit of the treasure, which is your way, your organisation's way of doing that with the young. How can we do that? How can we offer that to one another as a gift in these few days that we have together? How can we receive what others have to offer us as gift in such a way that we can enrich one another in our diverse ways of working together?